Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. House Speaker Mike Johnson today saying he believes he has the Republican votes to end a partial government shutdown by at least Tuesday. It began on Saturday after Congress failed to approve a deal to keep a wide range of operations funded ahead of a midnight deadline. Joining us now to unpack the economic impact of government shutdowns is Antoni, Chief Economist at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us. Good to have you here. Now, what does this partial shutdown impact? Which workers or industries feel the impact immediately? How fast does that ripple into the broader economy?
Well, hopefully, this will actually get resolved before the real economy actually has to deal with any of the effects. If we recall from the last government shutdown, which was the longest in history, the Trump administration did everything it could to actually keep the economy running smoothly, to keep, for example, airports running, to keep airport security and air traffic controllers on the job, and to make sure those operations were running smoothly. So, we are hoping that we will actually be able to pass, despite the objections of Democrats, a measure to keep the government open next week, and thereby avoid any kind of any of these negative effects on the American economy and the American people.
On that note, this is now in the hands of the House. Here's Speaker Johnson on how soon the shutdown could end.
So we'll get all this done by Tuesday, I'm convinced. We do have to do it by way of a rule process, which will be probably on our own. I don't understand why anybody would have a problem with this, though. Remember, the bills that have already been passed, we're going to do it again. It's a formality at this point.
Now, Hakeem Jeffries has indicated there will be no Democratic support. How are you watching this? How soon could the government be funded?
As early as this week. In fact, the first half of this week. So again, we are really hoping, we're keeping our fingers crossed here, that the Republican Party, since obviously, as you said, the Democrats aren't going to help at all, we are really hoping that the Republican Party is going to be able to pass the necessary funding measures and therefore keep the government open. And look, that's very important at a time when we need, for example, FEMA to have access to the cash it needs to help people who are suffering right now because of recent winter storms, whether those are ice storms in Tennessee or Kentucky, for example, the snowfall and the ice in the Northeast. We're seeing very cold temperatures in both of those areas of the country right now, and a lot of people need that aid. Obviously, the government is doing a lot of other things. We already talked about airport security and air traffic controllers, but all of these things need funding relatively soon to ensure that Americans are actually getting the help that they need, and frankly, the help that they were previously promised.
Now, it seems the current fight is over DHS funding. Senators are only extending funding for 2 weeks there, even though DHS already has multi-year funding from the One Big Beautiful Bill. Now, if the Senate changes DHS policy or structure, does that actually affect the money already approved, or is this more about control than cash?
Well, I think if the Senate really tries to make any substantive changes here to DHS, including trying to limit immigration enforcement or limit investigation of fraud, both of which, by the way, are completely legitimate activities of this administration, which have garnered the ire of Democrats, obviously. But if the Senate does try to make any of those ridiculous changes, then what's going to happen, I think, is the House is simply just going to reject those measures. And then we might actually get into some kind of standoff here where we might lose government funding for quite some time. But again, we're trying to remain optimistic and hopeful here that the Senate is not going to try any of those shenanigans, and therefore we can continue to fund the government, as we said. But you are right to point out that thanks to the big, beautiful bill that was passed last year, DHS does have access to several different funding measures. And even though that is spread out over several years, it is a considerable amount of funding that they can tap if they need to in the short term to keep operations going. And that includes immigration enforcement and getting these violent criminals out of our country.
And zooming out a bit here, how do financial markets and investors usually react to shutdowns like this? And how is this one different, say, to the longest government that we just had?
Well, typically, we actually don't see much of a market reaction from the government shutdown. That's for a few different reasons. One is the fact that markets typically are not reliant on government money at all, and we typically don't see much of an impact on the broader economy when we get these temporary interruptions, for example, from government funding. And that was even the case in the last shutdown, which, as we said, was the longest in history. Now, all that being said, if you continue to have these shutdowns, if you continue every month or two to have these constant interruptions in the economy, then you do see a chilling effect on investment. You do see investors, for example, keeping more liquidity, more cash on hand, and that will have an overall slowing effect on economic growth, which clearly is not a good thing. We don't want that to happen. That's one of the reasons why it's imperative that we not only get funding bills through Congress, but also that they be much more than simple 30-day CRs or 2-month CRs, whatever the case may be.
And on that note, with, say, repeated shutdowns or continuing resolutions, how does that play into American confidence?
Oh, it certainly doesn't do any good, right? The more people have to worry about, am I going to be able to travel in a month or two on airlines, right? That was that got very chaotic. Let me put it that way. In towards the end of the last government shutdown, because you had, for example, air traffic controllers. You didn't have enough staff essentially, and therefore you had to reduce the number of flights, and you had to reduce the congestion at airports in order to try to keep to maintain safety standards. And the result of that was a lot of people stranded. It was a lot of canceled flights, a lot of delays, and people obviously were not happy about that. That slows down businesses. For corporate travel, obviously, it's incredibly inconvenient for personal travel. These are not things that we want the American people to have to endure. So once again, we're very hopeful, and we're going to try to remain optimistic here that the Republicans in Congress are going to be able to get these funding bills through, because, as you've already pointed out, the Democrats have zero intention to lend a hand here, to lift a finger in terms of getting this funding through.
Well, EJ, Antoni, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.